Between 1790 and 1890, more than 7 million Americans would leave the familiarity of their towns, farms, and villages, and push into a wilderness that stretched for 2,000 miles. They carried wagons, rifles, and a faith in something they couldn't quite name. They also carried a terrifying risk, a 1 in 10 chance they wouldn't survive the journey. Death came easily to the frontier by hunger, by fever, by frost, by accidents, and sometimes by other human hands. Imagine standing at the edge of that unknown. Behind you, the east-crowded cities, cultivated fields, family and tradition. Ahead of you, silence, endless forests, rolling rivers, prairies without fences, mountains you can't even see yet. No maps to trust, no government to protect you, no certainty you'll see another spring. What kind of person decides to step forward anyway? That's where our story begins. Not in the textbooks or in the polished portraits of politicians, but in a rough-hewn cabin in the Appalachian woods, with a man named Thomas Harper, who believed that survival, dignity, and hope could be carved out of timber, sweat, and sheer stubbornness. The American frontier was never one place. It was a moving line, creeping westward with every generation. In 1790, that line sat at the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, where trees thick as walls pressed in on settlers like a fortress. By 1820, the line had shifted to the Ohio River, and families floated downstream in rafts and flatboats, their lives packed in barrels and crates. By mid-century, it ran across the plains, where wagon trains rolled toward Oregon and California. And by 1890, the frontier was declared closed, swallowed by towns, railroads, and farms stretching from coast to coast. But the land alone doesn't tell the story. To understand what it meant to live, struggle, and die on that frontier, we'll follow one family the Harpers over 100 years. Their blood and sweat mark the trail west. Their triumphs and losses mirror the millions who traveled alongside them. Thomas Harper, the patriarch, was born into hardship. By the time he moved into the Appalachian backwoods in the 1790s, he had already buried children, lost neighbors to fever, and carried scars from the Revolutionary War. But he was convinced of one thing, that land was freedom, and that the wilderness, however cruel, was the only place a man could truly own himself. His son, James, would grow up hearing wolves howl in the night and watching smoke rise from distant native camps. James's life would be shaped not by the forests, but by water. The Ohio and Mississippi rivers became his world broad, dangerous highways that promised both opportunity and ruin. Then came William, Thomas's grandson, who caught the restless spirit of the mid-19th century. He walked the Oregon Trail with his wagon train, lost friends to cholera, and saw graves dug in shallow soil along the route. But William didn't stop there. He chased gold in California, only to learn that the dream was often heavier than the reality. Finally, Sarah Harper, Miller, William's daughter, carried the Harper grit into the Great Plains. In 1874, she stood on Kansas sod, hammer in hand, staring at land that seemed to stretch to forever. Grasshopper plagues, prairie fires, and isolation tested her. But she built a home where nothing had been before. For generations, for frontiers. Together, their lives tell the story of America's relentless push westward. The frontier is often remembered in myth, rugged cowboys, daring explorers, men conquering wilderness, but the truth is sharper, harsher, and in many ways more human. The frontier wasn't only about adventure. It was about grinding work, about hauling water, plowing rocky fields, nursing fevers without medicine, and watching graves rise faster than harvests. It was about women who bore children in cabins with dirt floors, about children who grew up without ever knowing a town, about entire families gambling everything on land that might never yield crops. And yet, out of that struggle came something powerful, a culture of resilience, of self-reliance, and of belief that the future could be shaped by those willing to pay its cost. The Harper's story doesn't glorify the frontier, it reveals it. The mud, the blood, the hunger, the moments of hope and devastation. Why tell this story now? Because the frontier didn't just shape a landscape, it shaped a people. It forged values we still recognize: independence, courage, suspicion of authority, a love of wide-open spaces, and a restlessness that never seems satisfied. Even as America closed its frontier, the hunger to push west simply shifted to industry, to technology, even to the stars. The Harper family's journey isn't just history, it's a mirror. Their choices, their risks, their sacrifices echo questions we all still ask today. What are we willing to endure for a better future? How much of ourselves do we leave behind when we chase something new? And what do we carry forward, generation after generation, even when the frontier itself is gone? Over the next chapters, we will step into Thomas Harper's cabin in 1792, where firelight flickers on log walls and wolves howl in the woods. We'll join James on a flatboat drifting through fog, where pirates lurk in the shadows of the Ohio. We'll walk beside William as wagon wheels creak over ruts cut into prairie soil, and stand with him at a California stream where men claw the earth for dreams of gold. And we'll feel Sarah's fear as the sky blackens with locusts, and her determination as she plows sod with bleeding hands. We'll end in 1892, when the census declares the frontier closed. But by then we'll know the truth, that the frontier was never just a place. It was a crucible where ordinary people became something else, where hope and hardship intertwined to forge a spirit that still lives today. So let us begin where the American frontier was rawest, most unforgiving, and most uncertain. The year is 1792. The place, a crude cabin deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The man, Thomas Harper, farmer, husband, survivor. The night is cold, the forest alive with sound, and the frontier is waiting. The year is 1792. The frontier line of America runs jagged through the Appalachian Mountains, a barrier of endless trees and narrow valleys. Out here, silence is broken only by the crack of a rifle, the scream of a hawk, or the howl of wolves circling at night. Thomas Harper lives here. His cabin is little more than a box of logs chinked with mud, its roof patched with bark and animal skins. There are no neighbors for miles, no roads beyond a faint deer path. His possessions could be carried in a single wagon, a Kentucky long rifle, a hatchet, a pot for boiling stew, and a wooden spoon carved with his own knife. Everything else warmth, safety, food he has to make or take from the wilderness. By the hearth, his wife kneads cornmeal into flatbread. The smell of wood smoke clings to everything. Their children sleep wrapped in wool blankets sewn from old uniforms. Outside, the night presses close, and Thomas knows it is never truly empty. At dawn, Thomas takes his long rifle and steps into the forest. Every hunt is a gamble. He might return with venison to feed his family for a week, or return empty, exhausted, and weaker than before. The Kentucky long rifle is accurate but slow. One shot, then nearly a full minute to reload. If the deer bolts or if the bear charges, that single shot may be his only chance. The cold gnaws at his fingers, the snow crunches beneath his boots, and each breath fogs in the air like smoke. He spots tracks deer fresh. He kneels, touches the indent in the snow. His family needs this kill. He stalks silently, one step at a time, until he sees it. A buck, antlers sharp against the pale morning. Thomas steadies the rifle, prays the flint sparks true, and fires. The sound thunders through the valley. The deer falls, but Thomas doesn't breathe yet. He listens. The forest has ears. Wolves, or worse, men. A shot like that can draw anything. Frontier life was not only a war with nature, but with loneliness. Neighbors were days away. Mail, if it came at all, came once or twice a year. If someone fell ill, there was no doctor. If someone was injured, you prayed the wound didn't fester. Thomas remembers when his neighbor, a man named Eli, out to fell timber and never returned. They found his body weeks later, mauled by a bear. Another family vanished after a fever swept through their cabin. Death wasn't an interruption of frontier life. It was stitched into its fabric. And yet Thomas stayed, because in this wilderness he was free. No landlord, no taxes he couldn't pay, no armies marching through demanding loyalty. Just the land, his family, and the will to endure. One winter night, Thomas returns from hunting to find tracks around his cabin, human tracks. His hand grips the rifle tighter. He knows who they belong to. Native hunters. The tribes of the Appalachians were watching, always. Sometimes trade was possible, furs for iron, corn for salt. Other times, encounters ended in blood. That evening, he steps outside with a lantern. Just beyond the glow, a man stands silently, bow in hand, his breath visible in the cold. Thomas doesn't raise his gun. He doesn't move. For a long moment, the two men stare at each other, two fathers, two hunters, each defending a claim to this land. Then the native hunter nods once and disappears into the dark. Thomas exhales slowly. A truce, for now, but he knows it will not always be this way. The frontier has no lasting peace done inside. Life continues in a rhythm of hardship. His wife patches clothes until they are more stitch than fabric. The children fetch water from a frozen creek, their feet numb in worn shoes. Nights are long, and the wind whistles through cracks in the logs. Thomas stuffs moss in the gaps to keep out the cold. They measure time not in days, but in chores. Chop enough wood, and maybe you survive the winter. Plant enough corn, and maybe you'll have a harvest. Everything is maybe. Nothing is certain. One evening, as they eat venison stew, Thomas tells his children stories of the land back east. Cities with streets, schools, and bells ringing on Sunday mornings. The children listen wide-eyed, as though he's describing a foreign country. To them, the frontier is the only world they've ever known. Dangers come in waves. One spring, heavy rains flood the valley, sweeping away their corn crop. Another year, wolves take their pigs. When Thomas tries to plant again, frost kills the seedlings. Each disaster forces a choice: stay and fight through, or abandon the cabin and seek something new. But Thomas doesn't leave. He sharpens his axe, resets the traps, and plants again. The land may fight him, but he is more stubborn than the land. One night, in the dead of winter, Thomas hears movement outside. He readies his rifle, but when he opens the door, he finds a native boy, barely 12, shivering in the snow. Half-starved, Thomas doesn't speak his language, but hunger needs no translation. He hesitates. His own children barely have enough. But in the end, he breaks bread and gives the boy a blanket. The boy stays one night, then vanishes before dawn, leaving behind only a feather at the door. Thomas never sees him again. Yet years later, when his son James asks why he gave away food they couldn't spare, Thomas answers simply, because no one survives this place alone. By 1795, Thomas Harper is older, his beard grayer, his back stiff from years of labor. His cabin still stands, weather-beaten but strong. His children are growing, learning to set traps and split logs. The wilderness has not beaten him, though it has scarred him. When he looks west, beyond the ridges of the Appalachians, he sees an endless horizon. He knows his children will not stay here forever. The land pulls them onward, always onward. Thomas has carved his life out of the forest, but the frontier is already moving, shifting westward, calling to the next generation. And for James Harper, his son, the call will come from water the broad and dangerous currents of the Ohio River. By the time Thomas Harper's eldest son, James, came of age, the forest cabin was no longer the edge of America. The line of the frontier had shifted west, spilling into the Ohio Valley. Towns rose along riverbanks, flatboats drifted like floating. Barns and commerce pulsed through currents that carried not only goods, but ideas, people, and danger. For James, the river was life itself. The trees of his childhood gave way to water broad, endless, unpredictable water. The Ohio River was America's first great highway. It stretched nearly 1,000 miles, linking Pennsylvania to the Mississippi. By the 1820s, thousands of families built flatboats, loaded with furniture, tools, livestock, and dreams, and floated downstream in search of new land. James stood on the banks one morning, staring at the wide brown water. Fog clung to the surface, the current tugging at driftwood like a living thing. He could hear the creak of wagons unloading, the hammering of boat builders, the shouts of merchants bartering for goods. The frontier was no longer silent, it was noisy, crowded, restless. James's first journey was on a flatboat carrying flour, whiskey, and pork to New Orleans. The boat was little more than a wooden box, 30 feet long, guided by giant steering oars. Once launched, there was no going back. The current decided everything. The boat was packed, barrels stacked like walls, pigs squealing in pens, chickens flapping loose. Men slept on top of sacks of grain, their rifles always within reach. Women cooked in kettles over small fires. Children peered over the sides, fascinated by the endless water. James felt the thrill of movement, the horizon shifting each day, but he also felt the weight of risk. One hole in the hull, one hidden snag beneath the surface, and the river would swallow them whole. The river was beautiful, but it was merciless. Pirates haunted certain bends, especially in Kentucky and southern Illinois. They posed as traders, waving from shore, then attacked with knives and muskets. Entire boats were lost, their crews never seen again. Disease spread quickly in the cramped quarters. Cholera, dysentery, fevers. One sick child could doom half the passengers. Accidents were constant. Logs drifted like spears just beneath the surface. A sudden storm could capsize a flatboat in seconds. James saw it all. Once, he watched a neighboring boat strike a submerged log and break apart, its passengers screaming as the current swept them away. He never forgot the sound. By the 1820s, the riverbanks were dotted with new towns. Cincinnati, Louisville, Memphis, places that had begun as rough outposts now swelled with taverns, warehouses, and steamboat docks, James walked those muddy streets, hearing dozens of accents: Irish immigrants unloading crates, German butchers selling sausages, Yankee merchants shouting prices. He saw gambling dens, brothels, and preachers calling sinners to repental within a single block. For a boy raised in forest silence, it was overwhelming, yet it was also intoxicating. The river didn't just move goods, it moved people into a new kind of America, bustling, diverse, alive. One moonless night, while drifting south, James's flatboat was hailed from shore. A lantern waved, a man calling, safe harbor, come rest, trade your goods. Some men reached for the oars. James's stomach knotted. His father's words rang in his head. The frontier takes more men than it spares. As they drifted closer, he saw shapes moving in the shadows, too many for a simple farmstead. Rifles glinted in the lamplight. Pirates, the captain shouted, keep her straight, don't stop. And the men heaved the oars. Shots cracked from shore, splinters flying as bullets struck the boat. Children screamed. James fired his rifle blindly into the dark, praying it would buy them distance. The current saved them. The pirates' lanterns faded, their shouts drowned by rushing water. Hours later, silence returned, but James could still feel his heart pounding. That night he understood: the river gave life, but demanded fear in return. By the 1830s, flatboats gave way to a new power. Steamboats, these wooden giants, with their great paddle wheels churning, could move upstream as well as down. For James, it was like seeing the future: smoke belching from stacks, music spilling from decks, gamblers throwing dice in saloons while cargo shifted below. He worked as a deckhand for a season, hauling freight and learning the rhythm of the engines. He watched fortunes made and lost in a single trip. Cotton bales, whiskey barrels, even enslaved people were sold and shipped along these waters. The river wasn't just a natural frontier anymore, it was an artery of commerce, pumping life and greed in equal measure. One journey tested James more than any other. A cholera outbreak swept the boat mid-voyage. Within days, passengers were doubled over, vomiting, fevered, dying. James helped dig shallow graves on sandbars, the air thick with grief. He carried bodies wrapped in blankets, lowered them into earth, and returned to the boat with shaking hands. Each night he wondered if he would be next. When the fever passed, half the crew was gone. James survived, but the memory scarred him. He realized that every frontier forest, river, plain demanded sacrifice. No one crossed without leaving something behind. By his late 30s, James Harper had become a seasoned riverman. He had maps sketched by hand, scars from knife fights, stories of pirates and storms. But he also had hope. He saw America stretching, changing, building towns where once there was wilderness. The river, like his father's forest, was only a stage. Beyond it lay more land, more risk, more promise. One evening, James sat on the deck of a steamboat, watching the sunset bleed red over the Mississippi. He thought of his father, alone in a cabin, chopping wood against the cold. He thought of his own children, already dreaming of places farther west. The river had carried him far, but the frontier never stopped moving. Soon, the call would come again, this time across plains, through mountains, toward horizons no Harper had yet seen. And it would be his son, William Harper, who answered that call. By the 1840s, America's frontier line stretched far beyond the Ohio River. Steamboats churned through the Mississippi, towns blossomed on the banks, and farmland crept westward. But beyond those farms lay something larger land, so vast and untamed it seemed to have no end. For William Harper, grandson of Thomas and son of James, the whispers of opportunity came from the west, Oregon, a land of fertile valleys, green pastures, and the promise of a new beginning. But to reach it meant risking everything on the most grueling road yet. The Oregon Trail. William was restless by nature. He had grown up hearing his father's river tales, pirates, storms, Colorand. Though he admired James's resilience, William wanted more than survival. He wanted prosperity. Rumors of Oregon's Willamette Valley land, rich enough to yield wheat, orchards, and cattle spread like wildfire. But opportunity was never free. To reach Oregon, settlers had to cross 2,000 miles of plains, rivers, mountains, and deserts, often walking every step beside their wagons. In 1845, William joined a wagon train setting out from Independence, Missouri. Dozens of families gathered, farmers, carpenters, widows, children barely old enough to walk. Each family loaded wagons with flour, bacon, rifles, and the Bible. Each carried dreams of owning land no one could take from them. The wagons formed a line that stretched for miles. Oxen strained against yokes, wheels groaned over ruts, and voices rang out shouts, prayers, laughter, sobs. The trail was both community and crucible. Strangers thrown together, bound by survival. Every morning began before dawn. Men yoked the oxen, women cooked bread over campfires, children fetched water. Then the long march westward began. Most didn't ride the wagons, they walked. Wagons carried goods, not bodies. Dust-coated skin, blisters tore feet, and the sun beat down mercilessly. At night, wagons circled for protection, and guards kept watch against raiders or wild animals. Sickness was constant. Dysentery spread through tainted water. Cholera swept entire camps, striking without warning. Graves marked the trail, each with a crude cross or a pile of stones. Travelers said you could follow the Oregon Trail by the bones alone. William buried friends along the way, his hands blistered from shovels, his heart heavy with grief. Yet each morning he rose and walked on. The trail tested everything. Rivers had to be forded, oxen dragged wagons across, water rising to their backs, children screaming as barrels floated loose. Wagons broke axles, wheels splintered, and families were forced to abandon furniture, trunks, even heirlooms in the dust. Buffalo herds thundered across the plains, beautiful and terrifying, capable of crushing wagons in their path. Storms swept in without warning, lightning, hail, and winds that tore canvas covers to ribbons. Once William stood guard through the night as coyotes circled camp, their eyes glowing in firelight. Another time, he nearly drowned while helping pull a wagon across the Platte River, his boots dragging him under until strong hands pulled him back. Every mile west cost something: time, blood, possessions, sometimes lives, and yet, in suffering, bonds grew. Strangers became family. When one wagon lost its oxen to exhaustion, others shared theirs. When disease struck, neighbors nursed the sick. When children wandered off, the entire train searched. William, once restless, began to see the strength of shared struggle. The trail wasn't just a road to Oregon. It was a forge, burning away weakness, shaping resilience. One evening, as he helped a widow repair her wagon wheel, she thanked him with tears in her eyes. He realized then the frontier was not conquered by individuals, but by communities bound by grit and necessity. Months into the journey, the wagons reached the Rocky Mountains. For weeks, settlers had seen their jagged peaks rise on the horizon, impossibly distant. Now they loomed above, snow-capped and unforgiving. Crossing them was agony. Wagons tipped on narrow passes. Oxen stumbled on sharp rocks, snow-chilled bone and spirit. Families burned furniture for firewood, trading comfort for survival. When William finally looked back from the summit, the plains stretched endless behind him. Ahead lay Oregon. He whispered a prayer of thanks, though he knew the hardest miles. Still waited, at last, after half a year of walking, the wagon train rolled into the Willamette Valley. The sight stunned William. Green fields, fertile soil, rivers brimming with fish. After months of dust and death, it looked like Eden itself. Families, staked claims, driving stakes into the earth, as if to say, "Here, finally, we rest." William too laid claim, his hands trembling as he touched the soil that might feed his children. For a time, it seemed the journey was worth every loss. But William's story did not end in Oregon. Only a few years later, whispers of another promise reached his ears. Gold. In California, men were striking it rich overnight, filling pockets with nuggets the size of walnuts. The Oregon Trail had given William land, but land was slow wealth, patient wealth. The gold rush offered something else, sudden fortune, the dream of riches too great to ignore. And so, restless as ever, William packed his tools, kissed his family, and joined the flood of men pouring south. In 1851, the Oregon Trail had forged him, tested him, and scarred him. It had given him the strength to endure anything, and the hunger to chase more. But if the trail was about survival through community, the gold rush would be about isolation and greed. For William Harper, the next frontier would not test his endurance, it would test his soul. The Willamette Valley had given William Harper what his grandfather Thomas never had: fertile fields, a sturdy home, and the promise of a future that could stretch for generations. Yet William could not rest. The soil was good, but it demanded patience, years of toil for modest reward. Then, in 1848, the world changed. A man in California pulled shiny flakes from a riverbed, and news raced across the nation like wildfire. Gold. By 1851, the gold rush was in full fever. Ships crowded San Francisco Bay. Wagons streamed south. Newspapers shouted of fortunes made in a single afternoon. William felt the old Pulther Harper hunger for more. The Oregon Trail had tested his endurance. Now California would test his. Fortune. William joined a wagon train of men, leaving behind his wife and young daughter with promises of quick return and overflowing pockets. The road south was alive with dreamers, farmers, merchants, even preachers, each carrying picks, pans, and restless eyes. San Francisco was chaos incarnate. Tents and shacks sprouted overnight. Gambling dens, saloons, and supply shops charged outrageous prices. The smell of smoke, sweat, and seawater filled the air. William barely paused. He pushed inland toward the Sierra Nevada foothills, where rivers glittered with the hopes of thousands. The truth struck hard. Gold was there, yes, but not waiting in heaps. It lay hidden, scattered, buried deep. To find it meant endless hours of panning, digging, and washing gravel. William stood knee-deep in icy water, swirling a tin pan until mud washed away, hoping flecks of yellow would remain. Some days he found nothing. Other days, a few grains, enough to buy bread. Around him, men cursed, fought, and prayed. Camps filled with the sound of hammers, picks striking stone, arguments flaring over claims. Hope burned bright each morning, but by nightfall, exhaustion smothered it. The gold rush was not just a test of muscle, it was a test of spirit. Prices soared. A shovel cost as much as a week's wages. A single egg could sell for $1. Violence simmered. Disputes over claims ended in gunfire. Murders went unpunished in the lawless camps. Disease returned. Dysentery and scurvy haunted miners who lived on beans and salted pork. William watched men crumble. Some abandoned the diggings, broken and penniless. Others gambled away fortunes as quickly as they found them. The dream of sudden wealth consumed men like fire, leaving ashes in its wake. For months, William labored. His hands blistered, his back ached, his beard grew long and ragged. He pulled small pouches of dust from the riverbed, enough to keep going, never enough to leave. At night, by the fire, he thought of Oregon, the quiet fields, the laughter of his daughter, the steady rhythm of farming life. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if gold was not promise but poison. One evening, a younger miner asked him why he kept digging when others quit. William answered simply, "Because my family is counting on me. I'd rather die swinging a pick than return with empty hands." But deep down, he knew it wasn't only family. It was the Harper spirit, stubborn, restless, unwilling to accept what was given without reaching for more. By 1852, corporate mining companies arrived with machines and hired crews. Hydraulic hoses blasted hillsides into rubble, washing away entire landscapes. Independent miners like William were pushed aside, their meager pans no match for industrial power. The gold dream was fading. William's pouches of dust could never compete with the mountains of wealth flowing into company vaults. He saw the truth at last. The gold rush was not a farmer's fortune. It was a speculator's empire. Weary and lean, William made his choice. He gathered the small pouch of dust he had scraped from the earth months of labor, worth less than the promise he had left behind. He tucked it into his pack and turned north. When he returned to Oregon, his wife's embrace was worth more than all the nuggets in California. His daughter's laughter rang like music he had nearly forgotten. The land was waiting. Fields needed plowing, crops needed planting. The soil would never give sudden riches, but it would give life, steady and sure. William picked up his plow and laid aside his pan. Years later, when his daughter asked if he had found fortune, William handed her the worn leather pouch. Inside were a few dull grains, barely enough to glitter in sunlight. "This," he said, "is what men gave their lives for. But this," and he gestured to the fields, the house, the family gathered at the table. "This is what lasts." The gold rush had taught him the cost of chasing illusions. Land, community, family, these were treasures no pick could unearth. William Harper never struck it rich in California, but he carried back something greater, the wisdom to know where true wealth lay. And in time, it would be his daughter, Sarah Harper Miller, who carried that wisdom onto the Kansas prairie where new trials, new dangers, and new hope awaited. By 1874, the Harpers had pushed farther west than Thomas, James, or William could ever have dreamed. But with every mile, the frontier changed shape. The forests of the Appalachians had been tamed. The rivers James had navigated now swarmed with steamboats. Even Oregon, once the edge of the known world, had settled into farms and towns. The new line lay on the Great Plains, Kansas, a sea of grass stretching to the horizon, where sky and earth seemed to merge in endless blue. For Sarah Harper Miller, daughter of William Harper, this was home. Sarah's world was not gold pans or rifles, it was homesteading. When she and her husband Daniel filed their claim under the Homestead Act, they received 160 acres of Kansas prairie. The price was not money, but sweat. 5 years of labor, a house built, crops planted, survive that, and the land was theirs. But survival on the prairie was unlike anything the Harpers had faced before. The forests at least offered timber. The rivers offered fish and trade. The plains offered nothing but grass, wind, and a sky so wide it could crush you with its silence. Timber was scarce, so Sarah's first home was built from sod bricks of grass and soil cut from the ground itself. She and Daniel stacked them into walls, sealed the gaps with mud, and roofed it with more sod. From a distance, the house looked like a mound in the earth. Inside, it was dark, damp, crawling with insects. Rain leaked through the roof. Snakes sometimes slithered between the walls. And yet it was shelter. Sarah swept the dirt floor daily, cooked cornbread over a small stove, and hung quilts to soften the walls. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Every day was labor. Sarah rose before dawn to milk the cow, gather eggs, and knead dough. Then came the fields, planting corn, weeding, harvesting. With Daniel working beside her, the land slowly yielded, but the prairie never gave without taking. Summers scorched the earth, winters buried it in snow. The wind howled like a living creature, rattling the sod walls, seeping into bones. Sarah's hands blistered from the plough handles. Her back ached from bending over crops. Yet she pressed on, because homesteading was more than survival, was proof that a family could carve permanence into the shifting frontier. In 1874, disaster struck. The sky darkened not with clouds, but with insects. Grasshoppers, billions of them, descended like a storm. They ate everything. Wheat, corn, vegetables, even the wool from sheep's backs. The ground writhed with crawling bodies. The air buzzed with wings. Sarah watched helplessly as months of labor vanished in hours. She swept them from the stove, shook them from the sheets, crushed them beneath her boots. But it was useless. When the swarm passed, the fields were bare. The Harpers' homestead looked like a battlefield stripped, silent, ruined. As if insects weren't enough, prairie fires haunted the land. One dry autumn, Sarah smelled smoke on the wind. A line of fire stretched across the horizon, racing forward on grass that burned like kindling. She and Daniel ploughed a firebreak around the sod house, the oxen pulling the plough as fast as they could. Smoke choked their lungs, sparks scorched their clothes. When the flames roared past, the sod house stood blackened but intact. The fields, however, were gone. Sarah sank to her knees, tears mixing with ash. She whispered to herself, "We will endure. We must." The prairie was vast, but it was lonely. Neighbors lived miles apart. Months could pass without seeing another soul. Mail arrived rarely, if at all. Sarah sometimes stood at the door, staring across the horizon, feeling as though the earth had swallowed her whole. Yet even in isolation, there was connection. Families helped each other when storms toppled barns or illness struck. Quilting bees, church meetings, and harvest gatherings gave life rhythm, and laughter pierced the silence. Sarah found strength in those rare moments of community. They reminded her that even in the emptiest land, she was not alone. On the plains, women were not merely wives. They were doctors, teachers, builders, and defenders. Sarah learned to treat fevers with herbs, to stitch wounds with needle and thread, to shoot a rifle when coyotes threatened the livestock. She gave birth in that sod house, gripping Daniel's hand, screaming against the roar of the prairie wind. She raised children who grew up barefoot, chasing grasshoppers, learning to read. By lamplight, her strength was not measured in muscles, but in endurance, the quiet, stubborn refusal to break. By the late 1870s, the sound of progress echoed across the plains. The railroad. Iron tracks stretched across Kansas, linking homesteads to towns, markets, and the wider world. For Sarah, the train whistle was both comfort and loss. It meant goods, letters, and new settlers. But it also meant the wilderness was vanishing. The isolation that had nearly broken her was giving way to towns, schools, and fences. The frontier was shrinking again, swallowed by civilization. One evening, Sarah sat outside the sod house, her children asleep inside. The prairie stretched quiet and endless. She thought of her grandfather Thomas in his cabin, her father James on the river, her father William chasing gold. Each generation had faced a different frontier, and each had survived. Now it was her turn. She touched the soil at her feet, rich despite the plagues and fires. This was her gold, her river, her forest. This was her claim to the Harper legacy. By 1880, Sarah Harper Miller's homestead stood firm, a house rebuilt with timber, fields of corn and wheat waving in the wind, children growing strong. She had endured the grasshoppers, the fire, the silence. And though the census would one day declare the frontier closed, Sarah knew the truth. The frontier lived on in every hand that tilled new soil, every woman who gave birth in a sod house, every family that carved permanence out of nothing. Her children would grow into a new American America of railroads, towns, schools, and laws. But the Harper spirit, forged in wilderness, river, trail, and prairie, would endure. By the early 1890s, the Harper family had spanned 4 frontiers. Thomas braved the wilderness of the Appalachians. James steered the waters of the Ohio and Mississippi. William trudged across the Oregon Trail and panned California streams. Sarah carved a life out of the Kansas prairie. Now America itself was changing. The U.S. Census of 1890 declared something startling. The frontier line, that shifting edge of unsettled land, was gone. No more vast wilderness waiting to be claimed. No more unknown stretching endlessly west. Civilization had caught up with the horizon. For the Harpers, this wasn't just a statistic. It was a transformation they could feel in their bones. Sarah Harper Miller, now older and weathered, sat on her porch and listened to the sound of a train whistle. Once, silence had been her constant companion. Now, iron rails sliced across the prairie, connecting her homestead to towns that grew busier by the year. Where sod houses once dotted the land, wooden houses now stood. Churches rose with steeples visible for miles. Schools brought teachers and laughter. General stores sold sugar, coffee, and cloth. The prairie had not grown smaller, but it felt smaller. A journey that once took weeks by wagon could now be done in days by train. The vastness that once terrified Sarah now seemed tamed. The 1890s brought inventions Sarah could scarcely believe. Neighbors strung telegraph wires, sending messages faster than horses could gallop. Some spoke of the telephone, voices carried through wires. Even talk of electric lights reached Kansas. Though most farms still relied on lanterns, Sarah marveled at these things, but part of her missed the raw simplicity of the past. Progress made life easier, but it also dulled the edge of struggle that had defined her youth. In her younger years, Sarah had fought loneliness on the prairie. Now, isolation was fading. Town, socials, county fairs, and political meetings filled calendars. Her children walked to school each day, books in hand. One son dreamed of becoming a lawyer, another of running a store. Her daughter, bright-eyed, wanted to be a teacher. None of them imagined living in a sod house or ploughing endless furrows. Their world was wider, their ambitions larger. Sarah realized that for them, the frontier wasn't land, it was opportunity. The Census Bureau's 1890 announcements spread quickly. The frontier is closed. Newspapers proclaimed the end of an era, the birth of a new America. For Sarah, it felt like a eulogy. She remembered the grasshopper plague, the fire, the silence of endless sky. She remembered her father William returning from California with little more than dust, her grandfather James telling stories of pirates, her great-grandfather Thomas carving a spoon in his cabin. Now, those struggles were history. The frontier had been a crucible, and it was gone. But its spirit still breathed in her family. Sarah kept certain relics: Thomas's wooden spoon, worn smooth from years of use; James's hand-drawn river maps, edges stained by water and sweat; William's leather pouch of gold dust, nearly empty but rich with meaning; her own sod house quilt, patched through hardship and fire. Each object told a story of survival. Together, they were a family, archive not of wealth, but of resilience. Though the physical frontier had closed, America's hunger for expansion did not. Railroads reached the Pacific. Factories roared in eastern cities. Immigrants poured into ports, seeking their own piece of promise. Talk even began of looking beyond the Ward, Alaska, Hawaii, and distant lands. Sarah's eldest son once told her, "Mother, the frontier isn't gone. It's just different. It's in the cities now, in machines, in ideas." She smiled at him but said nothing. Deep inside, she knew he was right. Every generation found a new horizon. One evening in 1892, Sarah walked out to the edge of her fields. The wheat swayed golden, the sky burned orange with sunset. She closed her eyes and heard echoes of her ancestors: Thomas splitting logs, James steering a boat, William swinging a pick. Their voices seemed to ride the wind, reminding her that the Harper legacy wasn't bound to land. It lived in endurance, courage, and faith in tomorrow. The frontier, she whispered, was never just a place. It was a way of living. By the time the census closed the frontier, the Harper family stood at the edge of something new. The wilderness was gone, but the Harper spirit remained. For Sarah, the sod house had become a timber home. For her children, the prairie was no longer a void but a stepping stone into a modern America. The old frontier had ended, but its lessons carried forward. The Harpers had proven that survival was never enough. To endure was human. To build was American. By 1892, the official frontier was closed. But for the Harpers, the frontier was not a line on a census map. It was a thread running through their lives, binding great-grandfather to granddaughter, carrying stories like seeds across generations. Sarah Harper Miller, now in her middle years, began to see her life not just as her own, but as part of something larger. The struggles of Thomas, James, and William were not gone. They lived in her blood. in the objects they had carried, in the lessons she now taught her children. Inside Sarah's home, in a wooden chest, lay the artifacts of 4 generations. Thomas's wooden spoon, hand-carved in a wilderness cabin, worn smooth by decades of meals that kept his family alive. James's river maps, drawn on scraps of parchment, marked with bends, shallows, and places where pirates lurked. William's leather pouch, of gold dust, almost empty but heavy with meaning, a reminder that dreams can deceive, but also drive men to impossible feats. Sarah's sodhouse quilt, patched and repatched during plagues and fires, its fabric holding the smell of smoke and the warmth of children. Each object was humble, ordinary, yet each carried a weight far beyond its size. To Sarah, they were more valuable than gold, because they held the truth of what survival had cost. At night, Sarah gathered her children around the table and told stories. Not fairy tales, but Harper tales. She spoke of Thomas felling trees in a frozen wilderness, wolves howling beyond the firelight. She told of James firing a rifle at river pirates under a moonless sky. She described William chasing gold and returning with little but wisdom. And she shared her own battles, the grasshopper swarm, the prairie fire, the long winters of silence. Her children listened, wide-eyed, as though hearing the scriptures of their own family. For them, these were not just stories, they were instructions. Lessons carved in sweat and blood. Endure, adapt, never surrender. But Sarah also knew that the world was shifting. Her children's lives would be different. They would grow up with schools, railroads, newspapers, and perhaps even electricity. Their hardships would not be wolves or grasshoppers, but debts, politics, and the grind of industrial America. And yet, she believed the Harper spirit would carry them. If her children never lifted a plow or built a sod wall, they would still need the same courage to face their own frontiers. One evening, after a storm cleared, Sarah stood outside and let the wind whip across the prairie. In the hush that followed, she thought she could hear voices, her great-grandfather's steady tone, her grandfather's laughter, her father's restless hunger. The frontier had taken each of them in turn, but it had also left behind something indestructible, a spirit that whispered through the generations. Sarah reflected on how each Harper had left behind a lesson from Thomas. She inherited stubbornness, the will to build a home where no home existed. From James, she inherited adaptability, the courage to trust moving water and face uncertain shores. From William, she inherited humility, the wisdom that not all dreams yield treasure, and that land and family endure longer than gold. From her own life, she carried resilience, the knowledge that even in fire and plague, life could be coaxed from barren soil. Together, these lessons formed a legacy, not a straight line, but a woven tapestry. Each generation added its thread, and Sarah felt her own children already reaching for theirs. Sarah often asked her children what they wanted for their futures. Her son Daniel Jr. spoke of studying law in a town far east. Her daughter Margaret dreamed of teaching, of filling classrooms with books and voices. Her youngest, Jacob, wanted to farm, but with machines, not oxen. Sarah smiled. Each of them was chasing a different frontier, not of wilderness, but of possibility. She realized the Harper story was never about land. It was about the pursuit itself. In the autumn of 1892, the Harpers gathered, cousins, uncles, neighbors, to celebrate the harvest. After the meal, Sarah brought out the wooden spoon, the river maps, the gold pouch, and the quilt. She laid them on the table for all to see. "These," she said, "are what our family carried west. They may look small, but they hold our history. They remind us that we did not come from comfort, but from struggle, and that struggle is what made us strong." The children touched the artifacts with reverence, as though touching holy relics. Even the youngest understood that these objects were more than wood, paper, or cloth. They were memory made tangible. As winter approached, Sarah sat by the fire, her children asleep in their beds. She held the quilt in her lap, tracing the stitches with her fingers. In the quiet, she felt connected to a line stretching backward and forward, a chain of lives bound by courage. The census might have closed the frontier, but the Harper spirit was still alive, still searching. And Sarah knew that long after she was gone, her children and their children would carry it into new frontiers she could scarcely imagine. The Harpers had crossed forests, rivers, plains, and mountains. They had buried dreams and carried scars, but they had also built homes, forged bonds, and raised generations. The frontier was not gone. It had simply changed. The Harper's story was proof that the real frontier was not a line on a map, but the human spirit itself, restless, determined, and unyielding. By 1892, the Harper family stood in a world transformed. The U.S. Census declared the frontier closed, but Sarah Harper Miller knew better. She felt it in her bones. The frontier was never just about land. It was about spirit, and spirit does not end when the wilderness is mapped. The Harpers' story had stretched from a cabin in the Appalachian woods to a sod house on the Kansas prairie. For generations had faced wolves, rivers, mountains, fires, plagues, and storms. Yet each had endured. What they carried forward was not just survival. It was a way of seeing the world. The Harper's journey revealed a truth. Frontiers are less about geography than about courage. For Thomas, the frontier meant facing silence and wolves with a single-shot rifle. For James, it was the river's endless risk, pirates in the dark, cholera in cramped boats. For William, it was the false glitter of gold, teaching him that endurance outlasts fortune. For Sarah, it was grasshoppers, fire, and loneliness, and the stubborn refusal to break. Each Harper faced something new, something no one could prepare them for, and each transformed fear into resilience. That was the true frontier. The unknown, embraced instead of avoided. When the census said the frontier was gone, some mourned. But Sarah understood. Frontiers never vanish. They shift. They move from land to ideas, from wilderness to innovation. Her children were proof. One studied law, another dreamed of teaching, another farmed with new machines. Their struggles would not be wolves or rivers, but courtrooms, classrooms, and markets. And yet the essence was the same. Step into the unknown. Risk failure. Build something lasting. The frontier had not ended. It had simply changed shape. The Harper's story was only one thread in a larger tapestry, but it mirrored millions of others. From 7 million migrants crossing into wilderness with a 1 in 10 chance of death, to the countless graves along trails and rivers, to the towns built where none had stood, the frontier defined America. It forged values, independence, self-reliance, courage, suspicion of authority, hunger for opportunity. Values that lingered long after the last sod house crumbled, even as railroads stretched coast to coast, even as telegraphs carried voices faster than rivers. The frontier spirit remained restless, daring, impatient with limits. One night, in 1892, Sarah walked alone to the edge of her fields. The wheat swayed under a moonlit sky, the horizon stretching endless as ever. She whispered into the dark. The frontier was never just a place, it was a way of living. She thought of her ancestors, Thomas carving a spoon in a cabin, James sketching maps by lantern light, William bending over a pan of gravel, herself patching a quilt while locusts beat against the walls. She heard their voices in the wind, a chorus across time. The land had shaped them, but more than that, they had shaped themselves. As the 20th century loomed, Sarah knew her children would never know the hunger of wolves or the roar of prairie fire, but they would know their own frontiers. The frontier was not gone. It had simply turned inward. Frontier meant daring to leave the known. Whether it was a courtroom, a classroom, a city, or even someday, the stars, the Harper spirit would follow. Sarah placed the Harper relics back in the wooden chest. The spoon, the maps, the pouch of dust, the quilt, together. They told a story, larger than land. They told of a people who stepped forward into danger, who risked everything for tomorrow, who refused to stop at any line drawn on a map. She closed the chest and whispered, "This is our gold." The census declared the frontier closed in 1890, but the truth, as Sarah Harper Miller knew, was simpler. Frontiers never close. They only shift. From forests to rivers, from plains to cities, from soil to stars. The Harper family's journey was proof. Their struggles were not an end, but a beginning. Each generation built upon the last, carrying forward the stubborn determination that defined them. And so, while the American frontier as land may have ended, the frontier as spirit lived on. In every risk taken, in every dream chased, in every horizon pursued. The story of the Harpers is the story of America itself. Not perfect, not easy, but enduring. If their legacy resonates with you, ask yourself, what frontier are you facing today? Where is your horizon? Because the frontier was never just about the past. It's about the courage to face the unknown, in any age, in any place. If this journey moved you, subscribe, share, and join us as we explore more untold histories, because the past is never gone, it only waits to be rediscovered. By the turn of the century, the Harper family no longer stood at the edge of wilderness. The forests had fallen to axes. The rivers were busy with commerce. The prairies were cut by railroads and fences. The census had declared the frontier closed, but, for the Harpers, the frontier was not gone. It had simply changed shape. The new frontier was not about miles of land, but machines, wires, and ideas. The frontier was no longer measured in acres. It was measured in invention. When Sarah Harper Miller was a girl, messages took weeks to travel. A letter from Boston might arrive long after the sender was dead. But by the 1890s, telegraph poles lined the prairie, carrying words faster than horses or steam. For the Harpers, it was nothing short of a miracle. One of Sarah's sons, Daniel Jr., worked briefly in a telegraph office, tapping out codes that crossed hundreds of miles in seconds. "It feels," he once said, "like you can throw your thoughts across the continent." The telegraph turned America from scattered homesteads into a single conversation. Farmers could check grain prices in Chicago before selling in Kansas. Families could share news in days, not months. The land was still wide, but the distance between hearts had shrunk. Then came the telephone. The first time Sarah lifted the receiver to her ear and heard her neighbor's voice carried through a wire, she nearly dropped it. It was uncanny, magical, as though the prairie itself had learned to speak. For her daughter Margaret, who dreamed of teaching, the telephone was proof that knowledge itself had new wings. No longer confined to books or letters, information could now travel by voice instantly, connecting people in ways her great-grandfather Thomas could never have imagined. The Harpers marveled at it. Thomas had once stood silent in forests that echoed with wolves. Now his descendants stood in homes where distant voices rang through wires. The unknown had moved from the wilderness to the invisible world of signals and electricity. By the dawn of the 20th century, another marvel crept into towns and cities: electric light. At first, only the wealthiest households or city businesses had it. But soon, poles and wires spread outward, and even farmhouses began to glow at night. When Sarah visited a cousin in town and saw a room lit by electricity, she whispered, "It's as though the sun itself has been trapped indoors." Her children dreamed bigger. Jacob, the youngest, believed electricity would change farming forever, powering pumps, machines, and even cooking stoves. Where Thomas had chopped wood and lit candles, Jacob saw a future where labor would be eased by invisible power. The Harpers understood. Fire had once been their frontier. Now it was lightning. Perhaps the greatest change for the Harpers came in the fields. For generations, their lives had been bound to oxen, plows, and sweat. But by the 1890s, mechanized farming began to creep across the plains. Steel plows, reapers, and threshers turned days of work into hours. Machines cut wheat fields with blades sharper than any scythe. Steam-powered tractors began to replace animal labor, hissing and churning like iron beasts. Jacob Harper saved for years to buy a mechanical reaper. When he finally used it, Sarah stood by, astonished, as the machine swept through the wheat faster than 10 men. She thought of her father William, swinging a pick in California streams, and her grandfather James, steering against the current. They had battled nature with muscle and grit. Jacob battled it with machines. The frontier had shifted again. It was no longer the wild resisting man. It was man reshaping the land with steel. Each of Sarah's children embodied a new kind of frontier. Daniel Jr. became a lawyer, his battlefield not wilderness, but courtrooms. He argued cases that shaped land rights and commerce, believing justice itself was a frontier worth fighting for. Margaret, inspired by books and the spread of education, became a teacher. Her classroom was her frontier, where she tilled minds. Instead of soil. Jacob, the farmer, embraced machinery. For him, the frontier was technology, harnessing invention to wrestle more from the land. Each child carried the Harper spirit, but none lived as Thomas or James had. Their struggles were different. Their horizons were new. The Harpers realized that the definition of frontier had shifted. Once it meant cutting down trees or circling wagons. Now it meant adapting to inventions, mastering machines, and chasing knowledge. Sarah, watching her children grow, understood something profound. The frontier isn't gone, she told them. It's just wearing a new face. Where we once fought wolves, you'll fight ignorance. Where we once walked rivers, you'll walk wires. The courage is the same. The risks are the same. Only the tools have changed. As the 20th century dawned, America no longer measured its destiny in miles of land. Instead, it measured in progress, technology, and ambition. Railroads crossed the continent. Telegraphs crossed oceans. Factories churned steel, engines roared, cities glowed. For the Harpers, this was proof that the frontier never closed. It only moved from forests to fields, from land to mind, from survival to innovation. One evening, Jacob Harper stood in a wheat field, his reaper humming behind him. He looked up at the telephone wires strung across the horizon, the railroad in the distance, the faint glow of town lights. He whispered to himself, "My great-grandfather saw wolves. I see wires, but it's the same thing, a frontier, and it's ours to claim." The Harpers had stepped out of wilderness into the world of machines, and as the 20th century opened, they carried forward the same spirit, restless, unyielding, forever chasing the horizon. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Harpers had lived through forests, rivers, trails, goldfields, and prairies. They had seen wolves and locusts, pirates and fire, storms and hunger. They had buried dreams in shallow graves and planted others in fertile soil, and yet, as America shifted into the age of railroads, factories, and cities, the Harpers faced a question more profound than any before. What does it mean to carry the frontier spirit when the frontier itself is gone? Sarah Harper Miller's children had each chosen their own way forward. Daniel Jr., the lawyer, believed the new frontier was justice. He fought cases that defined land ownership and defended struggling farmers against predatory railroad companies. The law, he told his mother, is wilderness too. It has traps, predators, and trails. But someone must clear a path through it. Margaret, the teacher, believed the frontier was the classroom. In her small prairie schoolhouse, she lit lamps and taught children to read, write, and dream beyond the horizon. She often told her students, "Every book is a frontier. Every page, a new land to claim." Jacob, the farmer, believed the frontier was invention, with reapers and plows, with steam and steel. He wrestled more from the soil than his great-grandfather Thomas could have imagined. "Machines are our oxen now," he laughed, "and they never tire." Though their lives diverged, each carried the Harper stubbornness, a refusal to accept the world as it was, a hunger to push into what it could be. In her later years, Sarah often sat by the fire and thought of her family's journey. She pictured Thomas in his cabin, James on his boat, William in the goldfields, and herself in the sod house. Each had fought battles that seemed insurmountable, yet here she was, watching her children live in houses with glass windows, eating from fields harvested by machines, reading books by lamplight, and yet, she worried, would progress dull the Harper edge? Would her grandchildren, growing up in comfort, forget the resilience forged in wilderness and fire? One evening she gathered her children and told them, "Never forget, comfort is not the same as strength. Every age has its frontiers. Find yours, claim it, and carry our name with the same stubbornness that brought us here." The census may have declared the frontier closed, but the Harpers saw otherwise. For them, the frontier was shifting. From land to law, from wilderness to education, from survival to innovation, the family began to see their own legacy not as bound to cabins, wagons, or sod houses, but as a way of facing the unknown. Sarah made it a tradition to tell the old stories on winter nights. The children and grandchildren would gather by the fire, listening to tales of wolves, pirates, grasshoppers, and gold. Each time, Sarah emphasized not the suffering, but the endurance. She wanted them to understand that the Harpers were not defined by what they lost, but by how they refused to break. Her granddaughter once asked, "Grandmother, will we ever have frontiers like yours?" Sarah smiled. "Yes, they just won't look like mine." but they'll test you just the same. What, then, was the Harper spirit? It was not simply survival. Anyone could survive by chance or fortune. The Harper spirit was choosing to endure, even when the odds said you couldn't. Thomas chose to build a cabin where wolves prowled. James chose to steer his boat past pirates and storms. William chose to walk the trail and face the goldfields, even knowing failure might follow. Sarah chose to plant again after fire and locusts. Each Harper had looked at the unknown and stepped forward anyway. That was the essence. That was the inheritance. As the 20th century opened, America rushed forward. Automobiles sputtered on dirt roads. Airplanes, little more than kites with engines, began to test the skies. Cities roared with factories, and immigrants poured through ports. Chasing dreams, the Harpers, too, stood at the edge of this new century. Their struggles would not be wolves or rivers. They would be machines, markets, and ideas. But they understood. The unknown never ends. It only changes shape. One evening, as Sarah watched her grandchildren play in the yard, she realized something profound. The Harper story was not about cabins, rivers, trails, or prairies. It was about movement. The restless, unyielding urge to go farther, to endure more, to build something lasting from nothing. She whispered to herself, "The frontier never closed. It just moved into us." And with that, the Harper spirit passed, firmly into the 20th century, not tied to land, but to courage itself. The year was 1892 when the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. The line of unsettled land, that shadowy horizon America had chased for more than a century, had disappeared from the maps. To many, it was the end of an era, but in the Harper household, the news landed differently. For Sarah Harper Miller, now gray-haired and wise, the frontier was never a line on paper. It was a spirit, alive in the marrow of her family. And she knew you cannot close a spirit. Sarah often sat by her hearth and reflected on the lineage she carried. Thomas, her great-grandfather, carving a wooden spoon in a cabin deep in the Appalachians. Wolves pacing in the dark dot. James, her grandfather, steering flatboats down the Ohio and Mississippi, firing at pirates under a moonless sky. William, her father, trudging the Oregon Trail, burying friends in shallow graves, and chasing gold in California only to return humbled. Herself, patching a quilt while locusts devoured her crops, staring down prairie fires, building community where there had once been only silence. Each Harper had lived in a different America, but each had lived by the same creed: endure, adapt, and never stop moving forward. In a small chest at the foot of her bed, Sarah kept the family's relics: the wooden spoon, smooth from Thomas's hands; the river maps, water-stained but still legible; the pouch of gold dust, nearly empty, yet heavy with memory; the sod-house quilt, patched with smoke and fire. These were not riches. They were reminders. Each object whispered the same lesson. The frontier was not conquered by one act of bravery, but by daily choices made against fear, hunger, and despair. When her grandchildren touched them, Sarah told them, "These are our treasures. They are worth more than gold, because they show what we carried forward." The census might have drawn lines, but Sarah knew frontiers were not boundaries on maps. They were challenges waiting in the human heart. The frontier, she told her children, is every place where fear meets courage. Every time you choose to step into the unknown, you're living the frontier. For Daniel Jr., That meant the courtroom, where the law was tangled and uncertain. For Margaret, it was the classroom, where young minds were wild fields to be tilled. For Jacob, it was the wheat farm, where steel machines replaced oxen and progress replaced sweat. And for their children, Sarah's grandchildren, the frontier would be factories, cities, inventions, and even, someday, the skies. Sarah sometimes wondered if America would ever outgrow its hunger for frontiers. But the answer always seemed to be no. The wilderness closed and the rivers tamed, but industry opened. Machines roared, railroads expanded, ideas multiplied. And someday, Sarah imagined, her descendants might look to the skies, to oceans, perhaps, even to the stars. Frontiers never end. They simply change form. On quiet nights, Sarah swore she could hear them, the voices of those who came before. Her great-grandfather's stern commands, her grandfather's river songs, her father's weary sigh, her own cries in the firelight. They spoke not in words, but in memory, reminding her that she was never alone. Every harper carried the others. Within them, the frontier was not just behind them. It lived inside them. As her health waned, Sarah gathered her children and grandchildren. She opened the chest one last time and laid the relics on the table. "These are not just things," she said. "They are stories. They are proof that we harpers did not break, even when the land tried to break us. You will face your own frontiers, not of wolves or rivers, but of machines, laws, and dreams. And when you do, remember this: the frontier was never out there. It was always here." She tapped her chest, in us. When Sarah passed, her children kept the chest. Each relic was passed down carefully, not as property, but as inheritance of spirit. And each generation found new meaning in them. The spoon became a reminder of simplicity, the maps of courage, the pouch of humility, the quilt of endurance. The harpers carried these lessons forward into a new century. They left behind sod, houses for towns, wagons for railroads, candles for electricity. But they never left behind the one thing that mattered: the willingness to face the unknown. The American frontier ended on a map. But it did not end in the heart. It became a mindset, one that drove not only the harpers, but a nation. It was resilience, independence, courage in the face of uncertainty. For the harpers, the frontier had been forests, rivers, mountains, plains, and finally, machines. For their descendants, it would be something else, perhaps even worlds they could not yet imagine, because the truth was simple. Frontiers never close. They only move. The harper story is America's story, not neat, not easy, not free of loss, but marked by endurance and hope. And so the question remains, not just for the harpers, but for all of us. What frontier are you facing today? Will you meet it with fear or with courage? The frontier is no longer a wilderness. It is wherever we dare to step into the unknown. And as long as we keep stepping forward, the frontier will never end. If this journey through the harpers moved you, subscribe, share your thoughts, and tell us, what does the frontier mean in your life? Because history isn't just behind us, it is inside us, shaping every step we take. The year was 1892 when the U.S. Census Bureau declared the frontier closed. The line of unsettled land, that shadowy horizon America had chased for more than a century, had disappeared from the maps. To many, it was the end of an era, but in the Harper household, the news landed differently. For Sarah Harper Miller, now grey-haired and wise, The frontier was never a line on paper. It was a spirit, alive in the marrow of her family. And she knew you cannot close a spirit. Sarah often sat by her hearth and reflected on the lineage she carried. Thomas, her great-grandfather, carving a wooden spoon in a cabin deep in the Appalachians. Wolves pacing in the dark dot. James, her grandfather, steering flatboats down the Ohio and Mississippi, firing at pirates under a moonless sky. William, her father, trudging the Oregon Trail, burying friends in shallow graves, and chasing gold in California only to return humbled. Herself, patching a quilt while locusts devoured her crops, staring down prairie fires, building community where there had once been only silence. Each harper had lived in a different America, but each had lived by the same creed: endure, adapt, and never stop moving forward. In a small chest at the foot of her bed, Sarah kept the family's relics: the wooden spoon, smooth from Thomas's hands; the river maps, water-stained but still legible; the pouch of gold dust, nearly empty, yet heavy with memory; the sod-house quilt, patched with smoke and fire. These were not riches. They were reminders. Each object whispered the same lesson. The frontier was not conquered by one act of bravery, but by daily choices made against fear, hunger, and despair. When her grandchildren touched them, Sarah told them, "These are our treasures. They are worth more than gold because they show what we carried forward." The census might have drawn lines, but Sarah knew frontiers were not boundaries on maps. They were challenges waiting in the human heart. The frontier, she told her children, is every place where fear meets courage. Every time you choose to step into the unknown, you're living the frontier. For Daniel Jr., that meant the courtroom, where the law was tangled and uncertain. For Margaret, it was the classroom, where young minds were wild fields to be tilled. For Jacob, it was the wheat farm, where steel machines replaced oxen and progress replaced sweat. And for their children, Sarah's grandchildren, the frontier would be factories, cities, inventions, and even, someday, the skies. Sarah sometimes wondered if America would ever outgrow its hunger for frontiers. But the answer always seemed to be no. The wilderness closed and the rivers tamed, but industry opened. Machines roared, railroads expanded, ideas multiplied. And someday, Sarah imagined, her descendants might look to the skies, to oceans, perhaps, even to the stars. Frontiers never end. They simply change form. On quiet nights, Sarah swore she could hear them, the voices of those who came before. Her great-grandfather's stern commands, her grandfather's river songs, her father's weary sigh, her own cries in the firelight. They spoke not in words, but in memory, reminding her that she was never alone. Every harper carried the others. Within them, the frontier was not just behind them. It lived inside them. As her health waned, Sarah gathered her children and grandchildren. She opened the chest one last time and laid the relics on the table. "These are not just things," she said. "They are stories. They are proof that we harpers did not break, even when the land tried to break us. You will face your own frontiers, not of wolves or rivers, but of machines, laws, and dreams. And when you do, remember this: the frontier was never out there, it was always here." She tapped her chest, "In us." When Sarah passed, her children kept the chest. Each relic was passed down carefully, not as property, but as inheritance of spirit. And each generation found new meaning in them. The spoon became a reminder of simplicity, the maps of courage, the pouch of humility, the quilt of endurance. The Harpers carried these lessons forward into a new century. They left behind sod, houses for towns, wagons for railroads, candles for electricity, but they never left behind the one thing that mattered, the willingness to face the unknown. The American frontier ended on a map, but it did not end in the heart. It became a mindset, one that drove not only the Harpers, but a nation. It was resilience, independence, courage in the face of uncertainty. For the Harpers, the frontier had been forests, rivers, mountains, plains, and finally, machines. For their descendants, it would be something else, perhaps even worlds they could not yet imagine, because the truth was simple. Frontiers never close. They only move. The Harper story is America's story, not neat, not easy, not free of loss, but marked by endurance and hope. And so the question remains, not just for the Harpers, but for all of us. What frontier are you facing today? Will you meet it with fear or with courage? The frontier is no longer a wilderness. It is wherever we dare to step into the unknown. And as long as we keep stepping forward, the frontier will never end. If this journey through the Harpers moved you, subscribe, share your thoughts, and tell us, what does the frontier mean in your life? Because history isn't just behind us, it is inside us, shaping every step we take. By the 1860s, America was no longer just a land of frontiers. It was a nation divided. The debate over slavery, states' rights, and the meaning of freedom boiled into open war. The Union and Confederacy clashed, and in the process, the country nearly tore itself apart. For the Harper family, the Civil War was not just something read in newspapers. It came into their homes, their barns, their prayers. Cousins, brothers, uncles. Some wore Union blue, others Confederate gray. The Harper spirit, once united against wilderness, now turned inward, testing whether blood was thicker than politics. Two Harper cousins embodied this divide, Samuel Harper of Kentucky and Elias Harper of Missouri. Samuel enlisted with the Union Army. He believed the nation had to remain one, that the frontier had taught resilience and cooperation, not division. "We must keep America whole," he wrote in a letter, "or all the sacrifices of our fathers will mean nothing." Elias, however, joined the Confederacy. His family's land relied on Southern trade, and he believed the federal government had grown too powerful. In his eyes, the frontier spirit meant independence, even from Washington. "No man should own me," he told his brother, "not even the president." When war broke out, the cousins found themselves on opposite sides of battlefields. The same blood, the same heritage, now divided by flags. The Harper family received letters that painted two very different worlds. Samuel wrote from Union camps about mud, endless drills, and the grind of marching. He described battles where cannon smoke filled the air and comrades fell at his side. "It feels," he confessed, "like walking through a storm that never ends." Elias's letters spoke of Confederate camps, shortages of boots, hunger gnawing at men's stomachs, and the desperate pride that kept them fighting. "We have nothing but stubbornness," he wrote, "but sometimes that is enough." The family read both sets of letters around the same table, hearts breaking as words from one cousin contradicted the other. During these years, Sarah was a girl on the Kansas prairie. For her, war meant fear and absence. The men were gone. Supplies were scarce. Every knock at the door could be a Union recruiter, a Confederate raider, Or worse, she remembered her mother tearing cloths to make bandages, even though no one knew if they'd be used for Union or Confederate wounded. She remembered hiding in the cellar when raiding parties swept the countryside, taking food, horses, and grain. The prairie, once silent, now echoed with rumors of war. Even isolated families, like the Harpers, could not escape its reach. One of the darkest days came when Samuel's regiment clashed with Elias's unit at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. Neither man knew the other was there until afterward. The Harpers learned the truth from soldiers who returned. Samuel had been wounded by a musket ball. Elias had been captured briefly, then escaped. They had stood on opposite sides of the same smoke-filled field, each fighting for what he believed was America. The family wept. The frontier tested us against hunger and wolves, Sarah's mother said, but never against our own kin. On the Kansas homestead, Sarah's daily life was shaped by the war's shadow. Prices soared. Flour, coffee, and cloth were nearly impossible to afford. Neighbors whispered about raids, about men disappearing into guerrilla bands. Horses were seized for the cause, leaving families to plow fields by hand. Newspapers carried lists of the dead, and Sarah's heart sank with every name. The war was everywhere, even without battles in their yard. It was in the empty chairs at supper, the fear in her mother's eyes, the silence of nights broken by distant gunfire. By 1863, Samuel fought at Gettysburg, surviving days of brutal combat that turned the war's momentum. Elias endured hunger and retreat as Confederate resources dwindled. Both men grew weary, their letters darker, their words carrying less pride and more desperation. "I no longer fight for victory," Samuel wrote. "I fight so my comrades do not die in vain." Elias, in a ragged letter, admitted, "I no longer believe in our leaders, but I will not abandon the men beside me. That is all I have left." The war had stripped them of ideals, leaving only endurance, the very quality the Harpers had always carried. When the war finally ended in 1865, the Harpers were forever changed. Samuel limped home with scars that never healed. Elias returned, gaunt, bitter, but alive. They met again at a family gathering. The room fell silent. No one knew what would happen, embrace or violence. At last, Samuel extended his hand. "We cannot undo what has been done, but we are Harpers still." Elias hesitated, then clasped it. Tears flowed, for they knew the truth. The frontier had always been about survival. Now, survival meant forgiveness. For Sarah, the Civil War became the backdrop of her childhood. She would never forget the hunger, the fear, the empty fields. But she also remembered resilience, women carrying farms alone, neighbors sharing what little they had, families holding together even when torn. Apart, the frontier, she later told her children, wasn't only wolves and rivers. It was learning to endure each other's divisions. That is the hardest frontier of all. The Harper family survived the Civil War, but not unchanged. The scars of battle, the pain of division, and the memory of brother against brother remained with them. Yet, as always, they endured. The war had tested the Harper spirit in a new way, not against wilderness, but against themselves. And once again, they had carried it forward. While men fought wars, drove wagons, and swung rifles, there was another frontier, one carved not by axe or plough, but by hands that stitched, taught, healed, and prayed. The Harper women stood in the shadows of cabins, wagons, and sod houses. Yet their work often made the difference between survival and ruin. In their kitchens, schoolrooms, and birthing beds, they fought frontiers just as fierce as wolves or river pirates. For Sarah Harper Miller, and for her aunts, cousins, and daughters, this was the frontier of womanhood. Sarah remembered clearly. The night her cousin Mary went into labor, the sod house smelled of damp earth, its walls crawling with insects, the roof leaking rain. There was no doctor for miles. Sarah, still young, watched as Mary's mother boiled rags, and an older neighbor acted as midwife. Hours of screams echoed through the prairie night. At dawn, a baby's cry rose above the wind. That child lived, but many did not. Childbirth on the frontier was a gamble with death. For every new life, there were graves dug too soon. Yet, Harper women faced it again and again, choosing courage where fear might have broken them. Without trained doctors, Harper women became healers by necessity. They knew which herbs eased fevers, which roots treated coughs, which poultices drew out infection. When men returned from war with scars, or children burned hands on stoves, it was the women who bound wounds. When disease swept through camps, it was the women who mixed remedies late into the night. They carried knowledge passed from one generation to the next, not written in books but remembered in whispered lessons. Steep this root, crush these leaves, pray while you work. By the 1870s, education reached the prairie, and Harper women often became teachers. Margaret Harper, Sarah's daughter, took a post in a one-room schoolhouse. Her students were farm children who walked miles through wind and snow, their hands calloused from chores before lessons began. Margaret taught letters with chalk on slate, numbers with beans on tables, geography with maps drawn in charcoal. To her, every child was a frontier waiting to be explored. Some students could only attend for a few months each year, yet she persisted. Even if they learned just one book, she wrote in her journal, "They will carry it farther than I ever can." The Harper women were also architects of community. They organized quilting bees, where fabric scraps became blankets and conversations became bonds. They hosted church gatherings in sod houses, turning dirt floors into sacred spaces. They cooked for harvest festivals, reminding weary farmers that life was not only toil when men were absent at war, in mines, or lost to fever. The women kept families alive. They became both anchor and sail, steadying homes and pushing communities forward. Yet frontier womanhood was not only duty, it was also loneliness. Letters were rare, friends lived miles away, and silence pressed heavy. Sarah's diary spoke of nights when she felt swallowed by prairie winds. "I do not know if my words will be read," she wrote, "but I write them anyway, so I do not vanish." In that silence, women found strength. They spoke to each other in letters, in songs, in quilts stitched with patterns that carried hidden stories. Their voices shaped the soul of the frontier. As surely as rifles and plows, the Harper women also bore loss with a resilience that defies measure. They buried infants, husbands, and brothers. They mourned silently, then rose before dawn to milk cows and knead bread, because survival could not pause for grief. Sarah once comforted her cousin Anna, who had lost 2 children to diphtheria. Anna whispered, "I do not know if I can keep going." Sarah replied, "You already are." Resilience was not a choice. It was the only path forward. Through all of this, the Harper women shaped the family's legacy as much as the men. They taught children to read, so that maps and Bibles could be understood. They built communities that gave meaning to lonely miles of prairie. They carried memories, stitching the family story into quilts and diaries. They kept the flame alive when wilderness, war, and famine threatened to snuff it out. The Harper men may have walked rivers and trails, but the Harper women carried the weight of continuity. Without them, the family line would have ended long before the frontier closed. As Sarah looked at her daughters and nieces, she realized the truth. The frontier was not only crossed by wagons, it was crossed by women who endured childbirth without doctors, taught children without books, healed sickness without medicine, and held families together when the world split apart. The frontier, she told her children, was not only wolves and rifles, it was also cradles and quilts. Never forget that. And so, the Harper spirit was carried not only by men who sought horizons, but by women who held the line when horizons threatened to break them. By the late 19th century, the frontier no longer moved at the speed of an ox cart. It thundered with iron wheels, shrieked with whistles, and crackled with steam. The railroad transformed America. Towns appeared where tracks stopped. Goods traveled faster than rivers could carry. Families who once measured life in wagon miles now measured it in train schedules. For the Harpers, the coming of the railroad was not just a curiosity. It was a revolution. Jacob Harper remembered the first time he heard it, a whistle screaming. Across the prairie, louder than storms, sharper than wolves. The ground shook as a black engine roared past, smoke trailing like a storm cloud. His children clapped in wonder. Sarah, now older, watched in awe and unease. "It feels," she whispered, "like the world is being pulled apart and sewn back together again." For generations, the Harpers had measured time by seasons. Now, time was measured by the timetable of trains. The expansion of railroads required armies of workers. Immigrants, Irish with picks, Chinese with hammers, Germans with shovels, laid the tracks. They blasted through rock, bridged rivers, and spiked rails into soil that had never known iron. The Harpers met many of these workers when the line passed near their Kansas fields. Some stayed, building homes beside the track. Others moved on, chasing wages farther west. For the Harpers, it was a lesson. The frontier was no longer only their story. It belonged to the world. The railroad opened markets, but it also brought risks. Jacob Harper could now sell wheat in Chicago, sending it by train instead of wagon. Prices rose when harvests were good, and fell when trains carried too much grain at once. Railroad companies charged high shipping fees, squeezing farmers into debt. Jacob joined meetings of the Grange movement, where farmers banded together to fight unfair rates. "The wilderness tested our bodies," Jacob said at one meeting. "Now the railroads test our patience." It was a new kind of struggle, not against nature, but against corporations. The arrival of the railroad also meant new neighbors, Polish farmers, Swedish carpenters, Irish laborers. They all settled near the Harpers. Languages filled the air that Sarah could not understand, yet all carried the same hope. Land, freedom, a better future. At first, there was tension. Cultures clashed, traditions collided. But over time, necessity forged friendships. Quilting bees included Polish patterns. Harvest festivals featured German songs. Children grew up playing together, their accents blending into something uniquely American. The Harper family, once isolated in forests and prairies, now lived in a community richer than they could have imagined. The railroad also carried industry westward. Factories rose in towns, their smokestacks painting skies with soot. Blacksmiths became machinists, Carpenters became factory hands. For Daniel Jr., now a lawyer, this meant new cases. He defended farmers against railroad monopolies, argued contracts for factory workers, and warned his cousins that industry was a new kind of wilderness. It consumes faster than fire, he said, and once it starts, it is hard to stop. The Harpers saw firsthand that the frontier spirit was no longer about cutting trees, but about navigating systems of power. Sarah, now grey-haired, sat on her porch one evening as a train roared past. She thought of Thomas felling trees, James steering rivers, William chasing gold, herself fighting grasshoppers. Her family had faced wolves, rivers, storms, and hunger. Now her grandchildren faced machines, contracts, debts, and opportunities. She realized that the essence was the same: to endure, adapt, and move forward. The frontier had shifted, but the Harper spirit had not. The railroad also unleashed a flood of settlers farther west. Families who once hesitated now boarded trains, carrying trunks, tools, and dreams. The Oregon Trail was no longer necessary. The Iron Road had made wilderness accessible. The Harpers watched as Kansas filled with new faces. Lands that once stretched empty now bristled with fences and towns. The prairie no longer felt endless. Sarah whispered to her daughter, "When I was a girl, silence was our only neighbor. Now the world has found us." The railroad changed everything. It tied the Harpers to markets, neighbors, and struggles, far beyond their fields. It connected them to the world, but also threatened to consume them with debts and demands. Yet, as always, they endured. For every new challenge, they found the same answer their ancestors had found: resilience. The frontier was no longer only land. It was commerce, culture, and connection. And the Harpers, as always, walked forward into it. For nearly a century, the Harper family had carved its way west. They had felled trees, crossed rivers, marched wagons, plowed prairies, and built homes. Yet every acre they claimed had once belonged to someone else. By the 1870s and 1880s, the reality could no longer be ignored. Native tribes, Lakota, Cheyenne, Pawnee, Osage, were being pushed from their homelands. Battles flared. Treaties were broken. The Harper family, like so many others, was caught between admiration, fear, guilt, and survival. Sarah often remembered the story of her great-grandfather, Thomas Harper, who once faced a native hunter in the Appalachian forest. No shots were fired, no words exchanged. Just a long, silent recognition. Two men surviving the same wilderness, each protecting their own. That moment haunted Sarah. What had become of that hunter's children and grandchildren? Where were they now, as the frontier closed? One autumn evening in Kansas, Jacob Harper found signs near his fields, hoofprints, a small abandoned fire ring, and carved symbols in bark. Neighbors whispered of raids, but Jacob hesitated. He remembered his mother Sarah's words, "Not every stranger is an enemy." Weeks later, Jacob came face to face with a Pawnee man named Tahu and his family. They were hungry, their land stripped by broken treaties, their buffalo herds slaughtered. Instead of reaching for his rifle, Jacob offered bread. Tahu accepted with wary eyes. A fragile truce was born. In the months that followed, Tahu and Jacob exchanged more than food. Tahu taught Jacob his sons how to read weather from the sky, how to burn fields carefully to restore soil, how to track storms by birdsong. In return, Jacob offered spare tools, wheat seed, and help repairing a wagon. Their friendship was quiet, cautious, often hidden from neighbors who muttered against savages. But it carried an echo of Thomas's first silent truce. Respect across the divide. Not all harpers, nor their neighbors approved. Some feared Tohu's presence. Others carried bitterness from recent battles on the plains. Rumors of attacks. Hardened hearts. At one town meeting, Jacob was accused of harboring danger. He stood firm. "The land is wide enough for both," he said. "The danger is not them, it is forgetting that they too are human." His words were met with silence. Few agreed. But Sarah, now older, placed her hand on his shoulder. "You spoke like a harper," she whispered. The encounter with Tohu forced the harpers to ask questions they had long avoided. What was the cost of their homestead? If it meant another family lost theirs? Could the frontier spirit be noble if it ignored the lives it displaced? Was resilience only survival, or did it also demand conscience? Sarah believed the answer was clear. A true frontier, she told her grandchildren, is not only what you take, but how you treat those you meet along the way. Over time, Tahu's family moved farther west, driven by the pressures of resettlement. Before leaving, he gave Jacob a gift, a carved wooden pipe decorated with symbols of wind and earth. "This," he said, "is not surrender, it is memory. Carry it so you do not forget who walked this land before you." The pipe joined Thomas's spoon, James's maps, William's pouch, and Sarah's quilt in the harper chest. Another relic, another thread of legacy. In her later years, Sarah would open the chest and hold the pipe. She would tell her grandchildren the story of Tohu. "We were not the only ones who endured," she said. "The land tested them as much as us. We are bound to them, whether we admit it or not." The children listened, wide-eyed. For them, native peoples were often spoken of as shadows in history. But Sarah made them real, neighbors, teachers, survivors. The harpers could not undo the tide of history. Railroads, wars, and treaties had pushed native peoples aside. Yet in small acts of friendship, in bread shared and stories traded, the harpers glimpsed another truth. The frontier was never theirs alone. The frontier, Sarah whispered one night, was not conquest, it was meeting. And we must never forget who we met. In 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau made a startling declaration. The frontier line was gone. No more vast stretches of unsettled land, no more edge of civilization waiting to be claimed. The wilderness had been carved into farms, towns, and railroads. Too many, it was the end of America's great story. But to the Harper family, gathered around their Kansas home, it was only another chapter. They had lived through forests, rivers, trails, goldfields, prairies, and even war. And in each age, they had discovered the same truth. The frontier never ends. In a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, Sarah Harper Miller kept the relics of her family's journey. Thomas's wooden spoon, carved in a cabin where wolves howled. Outside, James's river maps, ink smudged by water and sweat. William's pouch of dust, nearly empty but heavy with meaning. Sarah's quilt, stitched through locust plagues and prairie fire. Tohu's pipe, carved with symbols of wind and earth. A reminder of neighbors often forgotten. Each object was ordinary, yet each carried extraordinary weight. They were not treasures of gold or jewels. They were proof of endurance, sacrifice, and memory. When Sarah's grandchildren asked her what the frontier had been, she did not speak of land. She spoke of spirit. The frontier, she told them, was every place where fear met courage. For Thomas, it was the forest. For James, it was the river. For William, it was the trail and the goldfields. For me, it was the prairie. And for you, it will be something new. Machines, cities, ideas, perhaps even the stars. She looked at their wide eyes and smiled. Do not think the frontier has ended. It lives in you. On quiet nights, Sarah swore she could hear them, the voices of those who came before, Thomas's steady tone, whispering of axes and cabins, James's laughter, echoing with the rush of rivers, William's sigh, heavy with the weight of gold and loss, her own voice, fierce against wind and fire, and even Tohu's voice, reminding her that the land had belonged to others before them, that the frontier was shared, contested, and never simple. These voices were not ghosts. They were memory, carried forward in every heartbeat of the family. One evening, as the sun sank across the wheat fields, Sarah walked slowly to the edge of her land. The horizon glowed, endless as ever. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The census might say the frontier was closed, but she knew better. The frontier had never been a line on a map. It had always been a state of mind, the courage to face the unknown, the stubbornness to endure, the hope to build a future where none existed. She whispered to the wind, the frontier was never out there, it was always in here. Her hand touched her chest, and with that she turned back toward her family, knowing they would carry the Harper spirit into frontiers she could not. Yet imagine, the story of the Harpers is the story of America itself, not neat, not perfect, not free of loss, but full of resilience, hope, and the refusal to stop moving forward. And so the question remains, not just for the Harpers, but for us all. What frontier are you facing today? Will you meet it with fear or with courage? Because frontiers never close. They only change. From forests to rivers, from prairies to cities, from soil to stars. And as long as we step forward, the frontier will always live on.